ideas, and I thought, I was reading through it, and I thought, if you don't mind, I'm just going to kind of go through my little thoughts about my mom, maybe paint a picture of her life. She was an artist, and maybe I can paint some little scenarios for you that went on throughout our lives. One of the things that she and I joked about once she was hospitalized for, pretty seriously actually, she got quite ill, and she loved her time in the hospital because she didn't have to cook, she didn't have to clean, and she thought the food was delicious. And the thing that she really loved, which turns out to be a medical diagnosis, but we didn't know it at the time, was the doctor found her inappropriately happy. But we thought that was great, and I said, Mom, if you ever have a tombstone, really that should be on it. You were inappropriately happy. So, just here's some thoughts. She had unfailing love for all of her very, very different children. She talked to everyone. She seemed class and race blind. When I was a very embarrassed teenager riding on the bus with her in Washington, D.C. one summer, and I was that awkward, angry, didn't want to be with my mother person. She was very nice to me anyway, but she was nice to everybody, and she talked to people on the bus, and she talked to anybody that passed by or she sat down next to, and it's a huge lesson to me. I wasn't able to do that when I was 17, but I held it as a model in my life. She gave us all a love of music, of art, of theater. She loved to laugh. She laughed every day. I think she laughed every day. She was in the Navy. She was a wave. And I have a very lovely memory of her teaching me to march on the beach in Drake's Island, Maine. Probably something to do with your small child. All right, we're going to march. And she taught me the song, and we marched up and down the sand. She was very poor when she was growing up, and I remember a story she gave when she was 13. She was given a face cloth for her birthday, and that was a big present to her. And it really said a lot about what material goods meant to her. She didn't need a lot, she didn't crave a lot. She was happy with a small amount, and she never really needed a lot of material things. And that made a big impression on me. We have many more things we take our face cloths for granted, but there was a time in her life when she didn't. She's very flirty. She's very feminine. She was flirty right up to the end. She loved people watching. One of the things we would do together when I was a student at UC Berkeley is we would walk up on campus and we would just watch people. And she really enjoyed it, and she enjoyed hearing people's stories and just wondering who they were. And it was, again, when I was a very unhappy teenager, it was something that we could do together, and taught me a lesson about that. Over the course of her life, she had an increasing sense of adventure and travel. She wanted to travel. And I've done a fair amount of traveling with my husband George, and different things that I've done, and that opened her up, I think, a lot to the idea of going traveling. And she went to Mexico to paint with a friend, and after her friend left, my mom was there for a few days, and she found there was a young woman walking around the streets, and they ended up talking to this young woman who's probably close to my age, had kind of run out of money, and my mom said, well, I still have a hotel room for a few days. You can come stay in my room. Total stranger. And because of my adventure, she thought, here's a person that I could help. And she also carried that on. She went to Harvard. I think she and Robert went to Harvard, and they met these young Danish guys. My mom wanted to sit on a bench, and these young guys were out playing hacky sack or something, and she said, could I move your stuff? Could I just sit down? And she ended up talking to them, and they were traveling the United States. She said, oh, I live in California. When you get there, just come. Here's my address. And she didn't know them, but they seemed nice. And sure enough, they showed up. And then my mom called me, and she said, oh, I met these very nice young men, and I'm sending them to your house. And I loved that she trusted us to take them in. And we did. They stayed with us for a week, and they were wonderful. And one of them kept up a very lively correspondence with her for years after that. She also really loved letter writing, and she loved getting letters, and she kept up a very, very lively correspondence with many, many old friends for a long, long time. I mean, Bob, I think you're still receiving letters from her friends. She never made me feel guilty for not being around more. I haven't lived in the same town as my mom for quite a long time, and she never, ever made me feel guilty for that. And whenever I would call and she'd pick up the phone and she'd hear my voice, she'd just answer so delightedly, and she'd go, "Lizzie!" And it was just, I love that she never made me feel bad. She always made me feel good. She loved people, she loved their stories, she was a good listener. She led a very interesting life. I think her cup was always brimming over. She always tried to put a positive spin on things. She was very frugal. She wished she had more money so that she could help her kids out, but she didn't crave more for herself. And she loved to paint. You all know that, I'm sure. Her style over time became more free. It became more colorful. I remember a story she said once when she went to her painting group and she was doing a painting, and she painted the water red, because that was the paint she had, and she thought it looked good. And one of the painters in the group said, "You can't paint the water red." And that was such an odd comment. She said, "Yes, I can." And she just went her own way. She only ever watched TV. She watched like PBS, she liked cultural shows. She never really just succumbed to television. She whistled. She was a great Scrabble player. She was a poet. She loved to listen to the Writer's Almanac. She always left us notes when we would come to the house. She always left little notes around saying, this was clean or this, and it always had little smiley faces on it. And every letter she ever wrote to me always ended with a little smiley face. And I've noticed I do that myself now. She loved having live music in the house, all kinds. She always had candles and fresh flowers on the table at dinner, even just around the house. She always blew us kisses from the balcony when we were leaving. I actually drove over there today just to see the balcony where she used to blow us kisses from. Her best friend was Turkish. Her husband was German. Other friends were from Mauritius, Estonia, Hungary. She just loved the world. She loved world culture. She was very clever with words. She named my sister's high school hootenanny group the Slightly Unstrung Five. And I had a singing group. It was a 1940s, 30s, 40s, sort of Andrew's sister's group, and she called us the Cats Meow. And then in the mid-1980s, my husband George and I were traveling, and we were gone for a year, and this is way before email, all this computer luxury, and we were writing letters back and forth to Poste Restante, and we were never quite sure where we were going to be anyway, and so these letters would take months to arrive. And so when George and I were in Eastern Turkey, we decided to get married. So we made our own little ceremony in a little island in Lake Van in Eastern Turkey. And I wrote home and I said, "George and I got married." And she wrote back, and so this is over the course of a month or so, she wrote back and said, "Well, I'm a little confused, do I have a son-in-law?" And I wrote back, very belligerently, and I said, "Yes, of course, in our law, we consider ourselves married." She wrote back and said, "Oh, how wonderful, I have a son in our law." I think she took everything that life dealt her with courage, with grace, with humor. And I want to thank her for being such a lovely role model on how to live a very full and beautiful life. Thanks. We're going to play something.